Well, thank you very much for having me here. I've spent a long time working on Craig, and to stand in the church that he was the first pastor here. But I want to thank my friends, first of all, for coming up here. Before I begin, I brought the best of Taylor County. There's nothing left down there that's any good in Campbellsville right now. I brought my wife, the provost who hired me, 4 colleagues, my clergy, and the owners of my favorite bourbon bar. So we are all here today. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, Elijah Craig, we have no actual pictures left of Elijah Craig anywhere. It was believed to be in the administrative building at Georgetown College for them to be one but it burned down. And so it disappeared as well. Now there's a local distant story that there was one there. This is the picture that most people will have of him. Strangely enough, I can't identify where this came from, but we can identify a picture of his mother that is in Paris in the Talbert Inn. What's the name of it, Tiff, that we went to? It's in the DAR there. And they were very protective of it. That guy was really weird. Okay, and but this is the Elijah Craig that we know. But that is not the Elijah Craig that most of you know. That's the Elijah Craig most of you know. Okay, that is the one that, small batch right there, the best of them all. But this is how people recognize him. But I'm here to tell you, there is more to Elijah Craig than bourbon. You're from here. So many things he did in this town and in this county. He was the first. He is the father of so many things here. But if you ask somebody like where my wife and I are from, they'll say, yeah, bourbon. They don't know anything else about him. And he is a lot more. So, his family. The Craig family basically came from the Scotland area, and they landed in Virginia. And they lived in the Piedmont region of Virginia. That is the second region after you get the Tidelands as you move in. Piedmont is a huge area that runs through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, and it is farm country. It's good farm country, particularly tobacco. Have you heard of the term Tobacco Road? That is part of Tobacco Road. His parents were Tolliver, 1704 to 1795, who moved up here and was one of the first people that were on the city commission. He did a lot in Georgetown as well, his Tolliver. And his wife Mary, who was better known as Polly, and they do have a charcoal portrait of her over in Paris that is very difficult to get a copy of. They had 12 children. The Craigs did, and Elijah was the 5th child. I'm going to step down so I can see that a little bit better. I'm pretty sure everybody can hear me. Is that going to hurt?
It could.
Okay, well, okay, this is better over here. Most of the families, he had famous brothers. During his lifetime, Lewis Craig was the more famous of the Craig brothers. He founded several churches up here in the Elkhorn Association. Have you ever heard of the Traveling Church? He was the pastor of the Traveling Church. A lot of people think that Elijah Craig came up with the Traveling Church. He did not. He came up a few years later. He still had business in Virginia. One of the reasons we have a problem with that is that, well, there's an Elijah Craig that fought at the Battle of Bryan Station where all the Craigs were. They were the defenders of Bryan Station Defender. Elijah Craig's, the person named Elijah Craig, it was Elijah's nephew, Lewis's son, that was the commander, so people thought he was already up here. He was not up here at that time. He comes in 86. They were tobacco farmers. Tobacco, at this period of time, in Virginia, the saying was, corn was life and tobacco was money. And tobacco was everything in Virginia. You had huge plantations ran by what we call the gentry, gentlemen, and then you had smaller farms that were ran by people like the Craigs. The Craigs were not upper class by any stretch of the imagination. They weren't hard scrabbled, meaning everything in their life was not difficult, like they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. But they were definitely not rich. They made do. They were not formally educated, but not illiterate, because Craig wrote I don't know if he dictated it or he wrote it himself, but he also had several ads in newspapers. But he had 2 major pamphlets that came out that were some of the hardest meanest things that a Baptist minister has ever said. Just cruel, just mean. I mean, one was against your second pastor here. He was the first pastor against your second pastor. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. He definitely was not ignorant. This man, as you well know, had a tremendous amount of business sense. Some people, you can give them a nickel and they will give you back a quarter. They're just that good with money. If you gave Craig a nickel, he would give you, and he earned a quarter, he would give you back 10 cents and keep 15 cents because he was about the money. But he knew how to make money. Many of these again fought in the Battle of Bryan Station. Craig's brothers, one of them was Lewis Craig, who was a very important Baptist minister, and another one was Joseph Craig, who was a bit off in the head. He was a minister. He's only known to have led one person to Christ, and his brother Lewis, who led many people to Christ, said, "You just need to quit. You've only led one person to Christ." And he said, "Thank you, God, that I led that one person to Christ. Now I'll try to find another." But Lewis Craig in Virginia, people were being, if you were not a Church of England person, an Anglican, you were what's considered a dissenter, and if you did not have a pastor, a church that was registered as a center church, you would be arrested. And so Joseph Craig was out preaching one day, and they grabbed him, and instead of going willfully, he just laid down stiff as a board in the ground and refused to move. Apparently they kicked him and did everything. He wouldn't move. He said, "I'd rather spite the devil." And another time they went after him, he climbed a tree and wouldn't come down. So he's just a little bit off in the head. But this was how they were at that time. But they fought in the Battle of Bryan Station. 1782, you know, we have stations and we have forts in Kentucky. This was a station, which means it's not quite as well defended as a fort is. Well, there's a huge native incursion coming down, Native American incursion coming down, and all the Craigs that were there, except Elijah, took cover there. They went in. And the one with the most military experience was Elijah Craig's nephew, Elijah. Well, what had happened is the Native Americans had not shown up in full force yet, and they were waiting to get more people there before they attacked. And so what they decided to do, they did not have enough water in the fort to handle a siege. So what did they end up doing? Polly, Elijah Craig's mother, was there. She said, "Well, every day at this time, we go out and we get water and we bring it into the fort for the night. So what we'll do is we'll take extra barrels this time and go out." And could you imagine the bravery? They said they weren't 20 feet from them. But the Native Americans were waiting until they had more forces because killing the women meant nothing. They needed to kill the men. So they brought it all in, and then they had enough water to sustain the siege. She's a hero, and that's why she's in the Daughters of the American Revolution over in Paris. So and there is a statue over near Bryan Station. Apparently it's in somebody's yard that is really hard to get to. And so we banged on the front door, and I tried to get Tiffany to jump the fence. I mean, it wasn't high, and she wouldn't do it. But you can see it online. So. Geographical regions of colonial Virginia are important. You cannot understand Elijah Craig without understanding Virginia. He was a Virginian in Kentucky. He brought everything with him, good and bad, from Virginia and made it to Kentucky. Now, of course, when you understand, until 1792, we were what? A part of it. Okay, we were called Backwoods, Kentucky, Fincastle County. There's so many things it could be called. But we're talking about the green region in the middle is the Piedmont. Now the Appalachian Plateau will lead over, and then you will start hitting Kentucky from there near the Cumberland Gap. All the Craig family came through the Gap. And the story of Craig coming over is kind of scary. But this is the region. No, but the people that lived on the coast known as the Tidelands, the coastal plain or the Tidewater, that was the rich people that did a lot of trading still with England. So they needed to be close to the coast. Now, colonial Virginia's way. They had every colony at this time, all 13 of them, had their own personality. And 8 or 9 of them, matters who you ask, had their own official religion that you had to be a member of. That's called the established church. We hear mostly about Massachusetts and New England because of who? The Puritans. Okay? As you move further south, you start getting into the Anglican influence, the Church of England. And so they were very royal, colonial mirror of England. Some of the things that we hear all the time. What is the University of Virginia's sports nickname? The Cavaliers. A Cavalier is someone who supported Charles I in the English Civil War. So what happens in the English Civil War, a lot of people that supported royalty against the Puritan monarchy come to Virginia to escape. And when they bring Charles II back after they decide they can't live without a monarch, he says, well, who supported me? What about Virginia? He said, they supported you to the T. And he said, the Old Dominion. And so they're known as Old Dominion. Okay? So Virginia is flat out royal. They have, the way their class systems are set up, very tight, very static. If you were born middle class or lower middle class like Craig, you could become a billionaire and you would still not be able to make the gentry level. You ever heard the term old money and new money? This is where it comes from. A lot of it comes from. And the Gilded Age, of course, but this is where you will see this. Old money and new money. They could have become rich. He was still not going to be anybody. Money made off tobacco in the backs of the enslaved. One of the things that we don't hear a lot about Elijah Craig is the only place I've ever seen it listed that he owned slaves. And he owned 32 slaves in Kentucky. Is at Heaven Hill Distillery. That's the only place I've seen that listed. Of course, why would we list that? It's not something we're proud of, right? But that is the brutal truth that especially Baptist ministers had no problem owning slaves. And he was no different. The religion was the Church of England. The Church of England broke off the Catholic Church, and when you came to the colonies, you were either, you had some colonies that weren't anything, such as Rhode Island. And you had Pennsylvania, it's kind of Quaker. You had the Quaker state. In New England, you had Puritans who were considered part of the Church of England. But in the mid-colonies to the south, it was straight up Church of England Anglican. And it was required by law for you to be that. If you did not want to be that, you had to get a minister to pass a test to get a location of the church to say, this is our dissenting church. It's not the minister, it's the church. So they don't like itinerant ministry. And that is a big part of who Craig is. Dissenters were illegal. The Church of England was paid for by law, and it was heavily taxed and supported by, for instance, you got something like 50 pounds of tobacco, no, sorry, 1,500 pounds of tobacco a year was given to you by your congregants, whether they wanted to or not, to pay the bills. And and then they had their own land. It's called glebe land. Like we have parsonages today. A lot of people still live on parsonages. And it's paid for by the church. At this period of time, the parsonage was surrounded by a lot of land. There would be people growing crops on it. And the people of the church went and got the crops to feed the pastor. And they got paid. And they charged inordinate fees for weddings and funerals. But this was the church. And the church and the state were tied together. You had to be a good Englishman meant you were a good Anglican. To be a good Anglican meant that you understood the king was your sovereign. That they all ran together. But we have this thing going on in America called the Great Awakening, where people are becoming saved, but not in ways that have been very popular through the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. And they get instantaneous conversions. And this causes a difference. And people in America were starting to see themselves as independent from England a little bit. Revolution is going to happen, and Craig had a part of it. But what happens is they're saying we can be separate from England. We don't have to do what they do. The common man, republicanism, is huge in this. Nothing, you can make it what you do. So he becomes a major minister. Dissenters are illegal. The Craig family's religion. Until 1775, they were all Anglican members. We knew nothing about them until 1765. Probably pretty innocuous. But in 1765, a revival of separate Baptist ministers came into the area, led by a guy named David Thomas, who was actually a regular Baptist. The entire Craig family were enlightened and made aware of their need of salvation, okay? But they hadn't made the commitment yet. And then the next few weeks later, another guy comes in named Samuel Harris, who's known as the Apostle of Virginia. And he gives these services. And he is a separate Baptist, meaning he is kicking, he's snorting, he's stomping his foot. Okay, that is where the separate Baptist tradition comes from, we still see. That is who that is. And then they become Christians. And they become dissenters. They leave the Church of England, but they're still paying taxes to it. They leave the Church of England, and then they become separate Baptists. Well, three of the Craigs, Joseph, Lewis, and Elijah, feel called to the ministry. And they began preaching. They've not been baptized yet. And baptism, said we do handle baptism and ordination a lot differently today than they did in the past. So a lot of people were becoming Christians under Craig's preaching. All three Craigs, well, at least two of them. One of them was pretty bad. And people were becoming Christians. And then they needed to perform baptism. But they didn't believe, they believed separate Baptists, unless you were ordained, you could not perform the baptism. Now that is not Baptist doctrine today. For instance, if you were a Christian and generally a member of that church, you can perform the baptism if you want to do it of your child or whatever. This period of time they didn't. Okay? It's called baptismal succession. We don't hold too much of that anymore today. But you did not have to have an education to be ordained. I'm a God-called man, not a man-called man. I don't need those fancy clothes that the rest of them wear. I will wear my work clothes. I will actually work 6 days a week, and I will preach on the other day, and I will know what my flock is going through. We're struggling with our farms. I'm struggling with my farm. You only had services about once a month. And on Sundays, other Sundays, Craig would go out and start churches everywhere else. But he's a dissenter. He is illegal doing these things. But he can't find anybody to baptize them all as he's doing this. And so he ends up running into North Carolina. He tries to get Samuel Harris to come back. Harris is like, I'm not ordained either. I'm like, you're the Apostle of Virginia. But he's not ordained either. So he goes, finds a guy named James Reed that says, I had a vision that you were coming to bring me to Virginia to perform baptisms. He said, I've been having these visions for months. Okay. Well, they brought him back. And he performed the baptisms. But what happened was, there was a little debate going on there. There was like hundreds of people there waiting to be baptized. But they picked him because David Thomas was the guy that preached there first. He told the Craigs they shouldn't preach because they were illiterate. As far as religion is concerned. They weren't educated. And one of the authors says that was like putting water on a flame. They got mad, and Craig had a temper like nobody's else. And so they got a separate Baptist to do it. And so they had a showdown. One was preaching over here and one was preaching over here at the same time. And people would go over here to get baptized if they like the separate Baptist minister. And they're like over here if they like the regular Baptist minister. And finally the regulars left because I think Craig had doused them pretty good. But some of the things that separate Baptists and Craig believed. Believer's baptism, meaning you confess Christ as your Savior, and then you're baptized by immersion. That's my place. No formal education is needed. If God said, lay it on your heart to become a minister, God will give you whatever you need. And that's the reason today that we have an ordination in Southern Baptist churches. They don't have to be educated. They don't have to be gone to seminary. We'll ordain a lot of people that are called by God. That's where that comes from. We still do that today. Moderate Calvinism, meaning, I don't want to really get a thing about Calvinism, meaning that they believe that people needed to be told to come and accept Christ. And that people could accept Christ. No paid ministry. This was a big deal, and this is something that Craig's going to hang his hat on the entire of his life. He believed that you're nothing better than the Church of England, or you're a hireling if you just get paid for it. And a lot of denominations, such as the Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ, they did not pay their ministers for years. So that is a belief that goes back. And Craig tried to bring that up here to Georgetown, and it didn't take. Okay? Ministers got comfortable. That's what he says. No paid ministry. Itinerant, meaning you have a church, but then you move around to other churches on other Sundays, finding other churches. There was little communities popping up everywhere in Virginia and in Georgetown, and they needed a minister so that they couldn't travel 15 miles to go to church and then go back. So he would go to them on Sundays. Let me see. They would also refuse to pay. You could buy the Center's license. The regular Baptists did this, but the separate Baptists would not. They said it is wrong for a government to charge me to perform the Great Commission. Also, a lot of times about these separate Baptist ministers, they had a martyr mentality. They really did. They wanted to show that we're going to fight for God, and getting beat up on the way is a badge of honor. Craig's ministry, and I'm going to go through this quick because I know we're interested in Georgetown. He pastored the church called the Blue Run Church. It was the second Baptist church formed in Virginia, separate Baptist church. He's pastored it until he came to Kentucky. He was one of the major people to found the First Baptist Association in Virginia. He started at least 5 churches, pastored several, and he was an itinerant minister. They also tried to do this thing. These guys wanted to they lacked titles. They had never been anybody. They were ministers, but they had never had any formal looking to me as a leader and stuff. So they decided what they wanted to do. They said, is there anything out there that says we can't bring Ephesians 4:11 back? About the offices of office. And one of them was apostle. Okay? And they said no. So they named 4 apostles, and Craig was one. The James River literally cut Virginia in half. So he was the apostle, and the apostles to the south side. And when people heard himself calling him an apostle, they did not like it at all. They saw it as pretentious. They saw it as nothing better. You're trying to put yourself over us. And we're Baptists. We don't have anything over us, the local church. Nothing is over the local church. But still back to that day. And so Craig goes back and they said, well, how did it go? He basically said it was an utter disaster. So they said maybe that one did die in the biblical era. So he was arrested 3 times for preaching in unlicensed locations. One time he was taken out of his pulpit. One time he was in his field, tobacco, and all of a sudden the magistrates rode up, ripped him right out of the field. And the other time he was just walking down the street and they grabbed him. He was always put in jail. Bail was set, but these guys, they kind of wanted to be arrested because it was like a mark. It was something that, I'm suffering for God. And they would always go and preach to the bars of the jail to the people. And that made him very famous. But Craig never would pay his bail. He would pay other people's bail that was with him, but he would not pay his own, which I thought was kind of neat. He fought for religious liberty. While all this is going on, America and England are getting warmed up. And Craig, one of the things the Baptists do is they realize they're not a big number, but they're growing. At this period of time, let's say 1776, there's probably 8,000 Baptists, regular and separate, in Virginia. And then there's Anglicans, but they're all like nominal Anglicans at this time, meaning that most of them are just showing up because they have to show up. But this is 8,000 is a big number, okay? And so the Baptists kind of hold this over the Virginia Assembly's head. They say, well, we need some of your people if you would come up and fight the colonial army. They said, well, we would, but they would want us to be their chaplains. And if they came back home and they went to an Anglican chaplain, and rather than a Baptist chaplain, well, our people would be really upset with it. So Baptists are playing dirty to get what they want. And so they began to press for complete and total religious liberty in Virginia. And Virginia is the home, by the way, of religious liberty in the United States. Craig several times is sent by Baptists as courier and spokesman to the Virginia Assembly where Madison was, where Jefferson was, where all these people were, to present the Baptist positions. One time he brought 10,000 Baptist signatures that says, we want religious freedom. And of course they cave in and we end up getting it, but it doesn't happen until like 1786. There's a war going on, sometimes things take precedent over it. And the neat thing about this is the Virginia establishment for religion is the foundational piece for our Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison wrote it, and guess who wrote the Constitution? We have a political science professor here that can tell you all about that. But that is the model for our establishment clause. Came out of Virginia, came out of Craig. Kind of neat stuff. While he was there, he certainly made whiskey. Everybody made whiskey at this time. You had too much corn left over. What do you do with it? I mean, you make whiskey. There are historians down in Orange County, Virginia, where Craig was from, that say, well, he didn't just go up to Kentucky and invent this all. Once he was making that stuff while he was down here first. I'm like, he's making whiskey. Help me here, Chris. All whiskey is bourbon. All bourbon is whiskey, but all whiskey is not bourbon. Did I say that backward or got it right? Okay. There is a difference in it, okay? Trust me. Bourbon is delicious. Whiskey is not. Okay? That is the difference for me, okay? But he was making, you know who the biggest, by the way, whiskey maker was in Virginia during this period of time during the Revolution? Even though he wasn't there. George Washington made tons of whiskey. Ministers made whiskey. It was not looked down upon for a minister to make whiskey or to sell. That does not happen until the 1870s and 1880s with the temperance movement. And by the way, that may be one of the reasons that people like to say Elijah Craig created bourbon. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, there's the Blue Run Church, still there today. Obviously, it's not the same church that was built at that time. The Blue Run Church, after the American Civil War, was given to the community, they call it the colored community, the ex-slaves. They used to worship with their members, with their owners. And the owners were like, here, you can have this church, we'll build a new one. And of course, at this period of time, they didn't really have balconies. What were they called? Where the slaves sit, what were they called? Slave lofts. So almost all balconies of churches in the South built in the antebellum era before the Civil War, they had balconies in slave states, and that is where the slaves sat. And so they gave that church to them, and they rebuilt this church, called it something different, just a few miles down the road. Why did Elijah Craig move? Well, his brother and his family had already shown up. He heard all the letters. He would have read the letters. He would have heard the stories. There is no way that this westernmost part, expanse of Virginia, was not the talk of the towns in the Piedmont area. And also, his parents would have told him. His brother would have told him. They had already been here. And then there were some funny things that were said. Lewis Craig stated heaven, told his brother this, and this is the name of a book my friend named Keith Harper wrote. Heaven, a mere Kentucky of a place. Heaven is a mere Kentucky of a place. Everything is here. The water is great. The air is great. The birds are great. Look what Philson says. The Philson Society. The fertile region abounding with all the luxuries of nature, stored with all the principal materials for art and industry, inhabited by virtuous and ingenious citizens, must universally attract the attention of mankind. What's he trying to do? Wrote this about 1784. What's he trying to do? He's trying to get immigrants. You read that, you're thinking to yourself, wow, Kentucky is a heaven kind of a place. And so Craig has heard all this. He's not coming for religious liberty. I've read several people say Then Craig came up here because the Anglican Church was in his way. I guess 1786, they knew the establishment of religion, Virginia was going to fall 4 years before it did. I don't think Craig would have left if that hadn't been accomplished yet. Why did he come to Kentucky? Now, some of the authors, and you have some wonderful local Georgetown authors that wrote histories of Scott County and Georgetown. I mean, really good authors. Some of them believe it was for religious liberty. Others are more like, he wanted to be somebody. He wanted to establish a utopia, a Baptist utopia, where Republican principles, where Baptist theology, separate Baptist theology, and people become businessmen without needing to ask permission for anybody else to do it, where everything is legal but must be moral. Where can we do that? That's what he wanted, and that was his vision for Georgetown. He wanted to be somebody also. He knew that if he stayed in Virginia, he was never going to be anybody. He could have had the largest tobacco farm in all of Virginia, but he was still not going to be of the gentry class. He's not Old Bunny. He wanted to be someone. He really wanted to be someone more badly than you can imagine. And I'm not going to tell you everything because I want you to buy my book. But you'll be interested to see some of the things that he did to become someone. And everybody, of course, Lewis Craig's family had come up here to Garrett County and to areas around this, and his brother, and founded all these churches. South of Elkhorn. Lewis Craig was on the committee that founded this church. So he came up here, and Craig decides what is the best area to go. He said it is going to be the Bluegrass region of Kentucky. And there are the regions of Kentucky, which are very important to see. You see blue, obviously, is the bluegrass. That is our horse racing, and that is our bourbon, and that is some of the best land that you will find. Look at that. We drove in today, the horse farms. Unbelievable. That's not going to grow. You can't do that in where I come from, Williamsburg, Kentucky. There's not that there. This is a beautiful area with a tremendous amount of potential at this time. So he moved to Royal Spring in 1786. Funny thing, he moved on the land without owning it. He said, I'll own it someday. A guy named Trigg owned it. Trigg was like, I got this from another guy and another guy. And so they couldn't figure out who owned it, but he still moved right on it. And he didn't get legal title to it for 3 years later. He immediately was named pastor of this church. He is the first pastor of this church. And he serves this church well for a few years. And then not so much. Okay? He got into a huge church fight. This church, when they built this church, you had about 85 people here. This was Robert Johnson's property. You all know who Robert Johnson is? If you don't, he's buried right there. Okay? He's right outside. And his wife were the richest people in the county. His son became Martin Van Buren's vice president. He was a powerful, powerful man. And he wanted a church. So he gave the property and had the building built. And then now he needed a preacher. So Elijah Craig carried this huge reputation for Virginia as an excellent preacher, by the way. One of the Craig brothers. He had been in prison for religious liberty. He had all the marks of being a great country preacher for this new church. By the way, for a while it looked like Great Crossing area here might be where the town, where we'd be bigger than Georgetown. Okay, but Royal Spring, you need water. And that was for the whole town. So he got into a church fight with Joseph Redding. In 1791, a minister that was not beginning, as soon as Craig got here, he started businesses. We'll talk about those in a minute, but tons of business. And it embarrassed the ministers in town. And they had several meetings that said, should a minister be paid by his church so he doesn't get tied up in the encumbrances of the world? It might as well said, should we do this for Elijah? They might as well pointed him out because he was involved in everything. He was a businessman. And then, so they were only meeting, this church only met once a month. That is normal. But the church was growing under Craig and the community was growing. He had one of the first tanneries for miles in this town. You need one of those. You also had one of the first blacksmiths before even Georgetown did around here. That's big business. They wanted to have more church services, but Craig did not want to because he was an itinerant minister going to other churches and he wanted to run his businesses. So this young guy shows up named Joseph Redding that is absolutely a great preacher. And he doesn't want to do anything to become a minister. So he starts attending church here while Craig's the minister. Well, while Craig's gone, they had heard him preach at other locations. They said, hey, while Elijah's not preaching, would you come here and preach on Sundays? And he said, sure. Elijah Craig's like, what? He had gone through this once in Virginia. He immediately started saying awful things about Redding around town. His sermons, his personality, everything. And this is in this church. So they end up having a meeting in this church. Apparently, there was an upstairs floor they used for storage. And a cabal of members of this church went up there and voted Elijah Craig out. And voted Redding in. Craig had already apologized. He said, I shouldn't have said that, which is unbelievable to me that he would apologize. And they said, so I went through gospel steps. I apologized, but yet you still brought me up on charges. And so the church is like, they said, all right, what we're going to do is we need to decide who is going to be the pastor of this church. And so there was a beam that ran right through the middle of the church. And the guy that was the moderator named Butler said, everybody that wants Elijah Craig to be pastor, come sit over here. This side of the beam. I want Redding to go over here. And apparently, it looked like, one of those war movies while the two sides are charging against her and they just bang each other really hard in the middle. Like Braveheart, there's just bang. Apparently, that's about what happened. And it looked like about 2/3 of the church wanted Redding and 1/3 wanted Craig. Well, what ends up happening is the Craig faction meets in the church without telling anybody and says, we excommunicate the other 2/3. We're the true church, Great Crossing Baptist Church. And then the Redding faction comes in and says, we exclude the 1/3 that wanted Craig as their pastor. And so both of them tried to send ministers to the Elkhorn Baptist Association meeting, and the Elkhorn was like, what? How many are y'all? And then they couldn't get it solved. And there's nothing more embarrassing than a church not being able to take care of its business. It gets in public. So rather than do what church people do today, they would have a committee of helps. It would go to the convention. They would go to the Elkhorn Association. And they said, figure it out. So they sent 10 people to this church, men from the association, and they heard all the evidence. And they said that the Redding faction was wrong. They should have. They didn't follow gospel steps. Craig had apologized. But then they said Craig was equally as guilty because he shouldn't have said all those awful things, which we can't find. You say it says awful things. I'd like to have found like a couple of them. So, because these guys didn't hold back. And they said, so you both are wrong. And then they said, nobody can sit down in this association until you get it figured out. Nobody knows how it happened, but they figured it out. And it appears that Craig served as the pastor here until about 93, and then Redding serves as pastor here for several years. And he has some pretty good years. And, Great Crossing continues to grow. But this church had been here 5 years, and it is in a huge mess. A mess that caused Baptists to have a bad reputation for years, was Craig. Craig would also always stick his nose in somebody else's business. He had no problem doing it. Around 1800, he began to verbally attack another guy named Jacob Creeth. Jacob Creeth was the epitome of a man that was somebody that Craig could not stand. He was rich. He dressed nice. He was a dandy, basically. He did not practice an itinerant ministry. He even looked down on people that did. And Creeth became pastor at a church called Town Fork Baptist Church. And then Craig gets so mad at Redding and his church that he leaves and he founds a church down that road right there named McConnell's Run. Anybody heard of that before? McConnell's Run? Well, that church is no longer there. Now it's what? What church is it? It's just down the road. Penn Memorial. Read the signs up front. Craig was the founding pastor of that church too. I mean, it should be called Craigville. Really, he did a lot. He did a lot. Again, what he does is he builds up a lot and he breaks down just as much. He breaks what he builds. So Craig moved his membership out there, and he was the pastor. But he's attacking this guy, Creeth, for taking money, for preaching for money, for not doing itinerant ministry. And I have a tremendous amount of evidence on that. And then he writes this horrible pamphlet called A Portrait of Jacob Creeth. Me and some of my friends have dug around a long time trying to find that thing, but it is gone. It is gone. In it, he calls Creeth everything you can imagine. He says, you're a thief, your theology is bad, you don't do this, you don't do that. And again, Creeth Henry Clay said he was the best preacher he's ever heard. Well, with Henry Clay, that's three people. He's not exactly known to be devout. This starts a problem. Now, another thing that actually happens in this church that exacerbates this thing is slavery is huge in this area. It really was. You had some Baptist ministers that got ran off, like William Hickman, like Barrow, like Carter Tennant, because they said, really, we're going to own human beings, but yet we're signing the Declaration of Independence and Constitution? You know, these people are human, right? It was a big deal, but not big enough deal to cost me money. People needed to work those fields and clear this land. Ethics went to the wayside real quick and easy when money was involved. And that's not a thing that just happens recently. So what happens is, Jacob Creeth and a guy named Thomas Lewis. Have you heard that name? He was from here as well. He was one of the richest people in the Lexington Scott County area. Traded slaves, 2 female slaves, and one of them was worth more than the other. So Lewis, Creeth said, "I'll pay you back," little later on. So Creeth was owed some money to Lewis. Well, Lewis's slave died, and they took it to church trial. And the church said, this is at Town Fork, down in Lexington, said, as Thomas Lewis is rich and Jacob Creeth is poor, we'll say that he needs to pay Creeth. This is a local church event, okay? This got out into the community. Basically, it said because he's rich, he'll pay the guy because he's poor. Not because he was right or wrong. No justice was done. And for Craig, it's all about justice. Craig is a member at this period of time at McConnell's Run, Penn Memorial down there. And Craig is like, well, if I've not caused enough trouble, here I go now. And he interjects himself into this and writes that horrible thing about Creeth. And now the whole Elkhorn Association is caught up in it. You totally forgot what the whole thing was about. It's about the exchange of slaves. But it became Creeth versus Craig. And it turns out that a whole lot of people like Craig more than they like Creeth. And so what happens is the fights get so bad, then in 1809, the people that just couldn't stand Creeth said, we're just going to leave the Elkhorn Association and we're going to form a new one called the Licking Association. And really they should have called it, we just left for Jacob Creeth because we don't like Jacob Creeth Association. That's what they should have called it. He tore everything up. Okay? He was at the inaugural associational meeting when they formed the Elkhorn Association. And then he was the guy that split it. Now, so he is dead when that's formed, and it goes on for decades, for absolute decades. Craig's legacy goes on in this. So, by the way, Jacob Creeth, now, if you're a Baptist at this period of time, you have a real problem showing up. You have this thing called Stone Campbell movement disappearing, and it is born here. Okay? It is born here. And Martin Stone and Joseph Campbell and Thomas Campbell Alexander Campbell were making big inroads here. Huge inroads. 1/3 of Kentucky Baptists became churches and disciples of Christ. Oldest church in my home county, Whitley County, was Baptist. Not now. It changed. Jacob Creeth leaves the Baptist after causing his share of trouble, and he did, and joins the Campbellites. And they say, well, that just proves he was a heretic to begin with. They're not. They're not heretics. I mean, it's just like, they're just different. So, now, founder of Georgetown. This is what some of you really, really want to hear. You got enough signs and historical markers around Georgetown with his name on it that everybody in here that lives in this town should know who he is. He's your town. I'm not saying if he did not come here, I'm not saying Georgetown would not be here. I'm saying there would be a town here, but it would be a lot different because of the way he started it. He moved into Royal Street property in 1786, like I said. The first thing he did is build a mill dam in 1786 and several more the following years. Have you ever noticed that street? You go to Royal, how many of you have seen Royal Gorge? I don't know, everybody's seen Royal Gorge. You've not, or not Royal Gorge, Royal Spring. How many of you seen it? Oh yeah, right. That big, that mill, that dam, that road in the back, that's his mill dam. Y'all know that, he built that. And it's still being used. But yet, in my hometown, we can't get potholes filled. But his bridge is still there. And he built several other ones. He owned the highway from here to Frankfort, from here to Lexington. He had a ferry across the Elkhorn, and he owned the bridge that went to Cincinnati. He built all those things. What is he saying? I'm building a town here, and we're going to need to be able to get to places. In 1788, I consider this his greatest gift, other than bourbon, because I like bourbon. In 1788, he started a classical school. Eventually became what? Georgetown College. He starts a classical school. It's interesting because he did not believe education was important for ministers, but he also understood education is very important for a business, for a community that is developing. People need to know how to do their businesses. And so he wasn't saying we're going to minister y'all up. He's saying we're going to give you some business education. So he built it. And it was successful. And then it was taken over by a group called Rittinghouse, who started schools all over the country. Craig was on the board of trustees. And then I can't remember, the 1828 or 29 is when Georgetown College was formed. 29. They bought Rittinghouse. And that became Georgetown College, the ones you have today. Craig is the lineal founder of Georgetown College, which I think is the greatest part of his legacy. Because Georgetown is a really, really good school. Ain't no Campbellsville, but it's good. Okay, started a hemp rope walk in a fulling mill in 1789. You know what a rope walk is? It would be, by the way, we had no problems with hemp at this time either. It would be like, Glenn, stand up here. What would happen is, he would take hemp string, okay? And then we would twist it, and then we would walk, and twist it again, and walk, and that's how he made rope. Okay? He made the first rope in Kentucky. So, and as a new community, what do you need? Rope. Probably need rope. You see, immediately started setting up a town. It was officially called Georgetown in 1790, but it wasn't officially called Georgetown. He didn't want to call it that, did he? What do you want to call it? Lebanon. But guess what? We had a president, and we were still part of Virginia, and they wanted to name it after their favorite son, so it got named what? And it's one word today, right? That period of time was Georgetown, which you would think it would be like George's town, but it was Georgetown. Let me see what else I want to tell you. He built a paper mill. This was the big deal. Kentucky needed paper. People love magazines, newspapers. This is how they kept up with one another. They had newspapers and the Kentucky Gazette, which, by the way, you can read all the old editions of the Kentucky Gazette. Now, it costs a little bit of money, but you can read them all. And Craig was all over the Kentucky Gazette, putting ads out to build this town. Well, the creator of the Kentucky Gazette's like, we need paper. Paper was coming from Pennsylvania, but they couldn't get the paper down here when anytime the weather was bad. So Craig's like, opportunity. I'm on the Royal Gorge, I have a spring. So he sets up a mill that beats the paper and makes the paper out of all sorts of nasty stuff, like pig ears and everything else. I mean, he sends a boy out to go around the town to pick pig snouts and ears up to make paper out of. I mean, so, yeah. But the thing is, he's always short on paper. And he has to make it for all sorts of stuff. And so he's having to charge people for paper more than he should. And he just can't get enough. And this is where he gets in major debt. Without a doubt, is his paper. He had two partners, called Craig and Parker, that left him as the sole owner of this. And he is complaining all the time in the Kentucky Gazette that I just can't pay my bills. This paper mill, can you please help me? And he calls them the prayerful sort. Will the prayerful sort be willing to, give me their leftover rags, cotton rags, to make paper? One time, he's gone, somebody breaks into his office and grabs some of his paper, takes it to North Carolina, and Craig was involved in one of the biggest counterfeiting problems in the history of the United States in the 19th century. Somebody stole his paper, and they used it to make paper, and Craig was like, he had to write all these letters and send his own paper. He says, look, this doesn't look anything like the paper that we put our bills on. This is not my paper that did this, but people said it was his paper. So, was it not? I don't know. Now, if you go to the museum downtown, you can see some of the paper that he made. They won't let you touch it. Okay? The paper that they have on display that says paper from Elijah Craig's at Heaven Hill is not real paper. It's just it's a problem. I got all over them about that. Okay, but he builds a paper with lots of problems. There's Royal Spring. By the way, Craig he owned most of the area of Royal Spring, but he realized in order to make my town work, when he sold the lots for it and stuff, he gave everybody permission to use the water at Royal Spring. I can't remember the date, but that was the main source of water in Georgetown until like 1940 or something. I think it still may be for that half of town. What, Water Street? Is that what it's called, Water Street? But Royal Spring, that little cabin down there is not his cabin. Okay. By the way, if you go on down, it's called the Miller's House. You know what I'm talking about? That house that's on Royal Spring. I'm pretty sure that is the house that Elijah Craig built in 1808 before he died, which is the first brick house in Scott County. He's doing a lot of firsts here, isn't he? And there is just one of your many signs in Georgetown showing his lineal descent to Georgetown College. Now, what is that? It's getting solid, right? Everybody knows that. Okay. Anybody heard the old story about what's inside those pillars? It's Craig Bourbon's in those pillars. Do we know? Are they there? No. Of course they are, Glenn. Don't let good historiography get in front of a good story. Of course they're there. That's the belief that they put his bourbon there. Now, how old would that be? Well, Georgetown's 1829. Giddings College was their first building.
1840.
So that's 200. That's pretty high proof, don't you think, Chris, for bourbon right there? That's my Georgetown. That's a pretty high proof. I've had 20-year-old bourbon. I thought that was rough. Now, just some interesting tidbits. He served as an election officer in selecting the first representative from Georgetown for the Kentucky legislature. He got paid £2 for it. He makes sure that he gets paid for everything. He doesn't charge a lot, but he's going to get paid. Okay? Craig allowed anyone attending services to use his ferry for free. That of all the things I learned about Craig after I did my initial read-through, that's the one that surprised me the most. That man loved money. Okay? He cared for a man named Philip Weber who was said to have an unstable mind. He let him live at his house and he took care of him. So Craig did a lot of things here. I mean, we're talking about how he just became a curmudgeon. But he did a lot of great things, and he still had a good heart.
He bought the first fire, he was part of the first fire committee that purchased the city's first fire engine. And he was the first fire chief. It's 1807. He lived one more year, okay? He built one of the first brick houses that I talked about. The house, it's still there today. This is really funny because this is in one of those, it's on a very busy street down on Water Street, the other side of Water Street, of Main Street. Traffic was like crazy and I couldn't get pulled in, so I threw my wife out of the car and said, take pictures. And so she just jumps out the car like I'm running and she gets pictures of the house. It'll be in the book, or you can just drive home and look at it. By 1800, Georgetown's population had grown from around 200 to 348. Great location. It was the third largest city in Kentucky. Look how small Louisville is. By 1800, he was the second wealthiest man in Scott County, behind only Robert Johnson, right up there. The tax records of 1800 indicate that he owned over 4,000 acres, 11 horses, 32 slaves, and business in both Georgetown and Franklin. Now, that is his peak, money-wise. Now, as Georgetown begins to grow, he has no competition for all the things that he created. He's the first, he's the only one. If you're the only gas station in town, you're killing it until that second one shows up. Then you got to split the profits. So, he starts hemorrhaging money, and the money he's hemorrhaging, I just cannot believe it's not from his paper making business. There's just no way it's not. His fortune turned and he was unable to pay his taxes. In 1800, he was selling off valuable property at an extremely low price. I have found his property sales, they're very low. His will demonstrates that his assets had disappeared by the time of his death on May 18th, 1808. He lost almost all of it. And his granddaughter thought he was still rich. And in a letter that I found, she's griping him and says, my grandpa didn't leave me nothing, he was rich. And he said, rich grandparents don't make rich granddaughters. I mean, I was like, did you not go see what happened to grandpa? Maybe if you visited more often, you got something. So, obituaries. Now, two different obituaries here. You got the Baptist obituary, and you got the business obituary. So, the Kentucky Gazette. On Wednesday last, at an advanced age, departing this life at Georgetown after a long and painful illness, the Reverend Elijah Craig. Mr. Craig was one of the first settlers in Kentucky and has been a very enterprising, useful citizen. He possessed a mind extremely active, and his whole property was expended in attempts to carry his plans to execution. He consequently died poor. If virtue consists of being useful to our fellow citizens, perhaps there were few more virtuous to men than Mr. Craig. That's the business. Okay? Now, what do the Baptists got to say about it? Okay? Baptist historian John Taylor, who was also in this area and was a pastor, wrote, he moved to Kentucky at a later date than his other brothers. His turn to speculation, making money, did harm in every way. He was not a great peacemaker in the church as his brother Lewis, and that brought us trouble on him. But from all his troubles, he was relieved by death, when perhaps he did not exceed 60 years of age, after serving the ministry, say 40 years. We're all, he didn't do anything, he never moral issues, but he was petulant fault finding. Just petulant fault finding. Okay, now it's starting moving. Okay, so that's that. Bourbon. I'm going to just tell you a bit about bourbon. I guess I won't tell you about where bourbon comes from and how you make bourbon. You can look that up. You all know where the name bourbon, why it's called bourbon? It's bourbon.
No, it's not now. Okay. There's a book coming out next year, and I'll tell you in a minute. Okay, what else? Where did Craig get the reputation of being the first person to make bourbon? A guy named Richard Collins in 1874 wrote the history of Kentucky. His father had written one 30 years before. Collins says that bourbon was created in 1789 on the West Spring in Georgetown. Who owned it? Craig owned it. That's where it comes from. That's the one source. Okay? Unless you really, really dig into this and get into genealogies, and nobody's better, by the way, than genealogies in here. The Mormons, LDS, they're great. You get into their databases, they get everything.
And I traced a few more things down that may support Elijah Craig's case. He's related to Richards. His niece married Richards. So maybe there's something going on there. It certainly doesn't hurt his case that he created bourbon. There's so many people, Pepper, and there's so many other people say he created it. And when it comes right down to it, nobody knows. But if you'll buy me a drink, I'll say it's Elijah Craig every time. Okay? Historically, as a historian, it's very difficult for me to say I can tie it down. Great stories about how supposedly discovered. I'll tell you one. Elijah Craig knew he would not waste a penny. Never wasted a penny. So one day he had barrels that he had been gathering in his mill, and he was going to put his whiskey in it. And the fire started, and so the barrels got charred. And so he put his whiskey in it and sent it down to New Orleans. And on the way there, all the tannin and all those wonderful things got into it to give it that really pretty brown hue, you know, that amber hue. And it had changed. It was no longer whiskey. It was something else. That's just one of the stories. There are two other stories that go along with it, but they're fun. So what I want to just tell you as I close, Elijah Craig, he's bourbon, okay? May his name be revered all times for that, but he's a lot more than bourbon. Thank you.